3일자 첫 번째 발표는 노스캐롤라이나의대 캐런 블루스 교수님을 모시고 마음챙김과 자기연민, 청소년이 건강으로 가는 길에 대한 강의를 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 교수님은 노스캐롤라이나의대 의과대학 전인과 교수이시고 자기연민심을 가진 10대라는 책을 저술하셨습니다. 큰 박수로서 캐런 블루스 교수님을 모시겠습니다.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be talking today about mindfulness and self-compassion and pathways to healthy functioning in youth. So I'll be reviewing and going through the research on mindfulness and self-compassion and youth, and just bringing you up to date on what's been done in the research world. So I'm going to be talking a little bit to start with the challenges of adolescence and how difficult adolescence is right now, particularly at the time of the pandemic. I'll be talking also about mindfulness, offering one definition of mindfulness, and then reviewing the research on youth and mindfulness. And then talking about self-compassion and also a definition of self-compassion, and reviewing the research that's out there right now on self-compassion and youth. So first, challenges of adolescence. We know that about 14% of youth between the ages of 13 and 18 years old experience a mood disorder. So what we mean by that is something like depression. And 32% experience anxiety, significant anxiety. 19% are diagnosed with a behavior disorder. And 11% have a substance use disorder. So what this means is that overall, about almost a quarter of teens have some kind of severe impairment or distress that really interrupts their ability to function in a healthy way in their world. More recently, what we see is that, and this is a Time magazine cover from November 2016. And what we know is that between the years of 2012 and 2015, depression increased among girls by about 50% and among boys by 21%. And among those youth between 12 and 14, in 2014 compared to 2007, about 3 times as many girls and twice as many boys took their own lives. And this was obviously before COVID. It's much worse now. In fact, what we know now is that 18.8%, about 19% of high school students seriously consider suicide, and that about 9% of high school students actually attempt suicide. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of studies that have been done since COVID. And one study, it was published in China, and this is among youth between the ages of 6 and 15. And this data were collected in April 2020. So this was at the very beginning of the pandemic. What we know from this group of about 1,000 youth, 12% of them were self-reported depression, 90% anxiety, and 6% both depression and anxiety. And in a study in India, among 121 youth who were quarantined and 131 who weren't quarantined, among all those youth between the ages of 9 and 18, 66% said that they felt helpless, 69% said they were worried, and 62% expressed or self-reported that they experienced fear. And that many of these attributes, fear, nervousness, annoyance, anxiety-related insomnia, isolation, and sadness, were significantly more in the group that were quarantined. And then in a study in the US over last year from April to October, mental health hospital emergency visits increased by 31% among youth between 12 and 17, and by 24% for youth between the age of 5 and 11. So it looks like from during this time of COVID that teenagers are suffering the most, and youth are younger youth between the ages of 5 and 11 are suffering also. But we know that the teenage years in particular are a time when it's the teens' job to go out and explore and figure out who they are, develop their own sense of identity. And they can't do this when they're at home and they can't, and they're with their family. They can't develop the kind of relationships with peers that they should be developing, and also can't try out different activities and explorations the way that they are supposed to at this age. So what can we do, and how can mindfulness help? So now I'm going to just go over the definition of mindfulness that we'll be using. I know that you're all very familiar with mindfulness, this being the third day of the conference. But the definition that I'll be using that is largely accepted is the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. So there are two main components to this definition of mindfulness. One is paying attention or awareness, and the other is the way that we're paying attention without judgment, noticing what's happening, noticing sensations as they arise, noticing thoughts, noticing feelings as they're arising. And I'll be going over information and data from all these different meta-analyses and reviews. So for those of you who don't know, a meta-analysis is a summary of studies. So it's when you take a number of studies, put them together, and statistically analyze them. So you come out with a basic overall understanding of what these various studies are saying. These different studies these different meta-analyses and reviews focused on different things. So for example, the Kohut, Stinson, Davies, Chalmers, Ruskin, and Van Wyck meta-analysis focused on chronic pain. So looked at people with all kinds of chronic pain. Zenner and McKeering focused on studies that were done in schools. So they had different concentrations, really. And I'm just going to offer a description of what the different populations that these studies looked at overall. So the participants were between the ages of 4 and 21. They were from public and private schools. Most of the studies took place during school hours. They largely came from the US, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and Hong Kong, and looked at overall outcomes of well-being. So things like anxiety, depression, stress, coping, self-regulation, self-compassion, optimism, and looked at cognitive functioning as well. So executive functioning. And physical measures. Cortisol, we know cortisol is a hormone that measures stress. Heart rate also is affected by stress, and sleeping patterns. Also, these different studies looked at studies that were conducted by a teacher who had received some training in mindfulness programs. And sometimes the studies looked at interventions that were conducted or were led by an outside facilitator. The intensity of the different programs, the different interventions varied. Some of them were, and the content varied as well. Many of them had different components of MBSR. We know that MBSR is the most well-studied intervention for adults. So many of the programs looked at different elements of MBSR, like breath awareness and loving kindness. The duration varied from 4 to 24 weeks, but averaged around 8 weeks, and also varied from 160 to 3,700 minutes. So there's a large variation in there, obviously. The amount of home practice that was required also varied. And there are many different types of interventions. And so we have here MBSR, which of course is the most well-known. Learning to Breathe is a program for youth developed by Trish Broderick, and that's a modified version of MBSR. Mindful Schools is one of the oldest programs for mindfulness programs for students in schools. Mindfulness in Schools is a program out of the United Kingdom that also has been very popular there and other places. And then there are various different programs that had used different components or elements of MBSR. And so now I'm just going to be talking a little bit about what these different programs found in these and were reported in these meta-analyses and reviews. So what we know is that there were positive effects on depression, anxiety, externalizing problems like fighting or attendance, violence, positive effects on positive mood or positive affect, pro-social functioning, empathy, resilience to stress, disruptive behavior in schools. There's also lower suicide ideation, so less thinking about suicide, improvements in executive functioning, memory, working memory, which of course is very important in schools, and cognitive performance, less anxiety. And in one of these meta-analyses, what they found was that there were larger effects at follow-up, than at right after the intervention. So what they reported was that sometimes it takes a little bit longer to see the effects of the intervention. They don't appear as well right at the end of the study. Many of these analyses also reported on moderators. And what moderators are things that, different constructs that can affect the outcomes. So it answers the question, when and for whom are the programs most effective? So one of the moderators that was examined was the program facilitator. In other words, is the program more effective if a classroom teacher leads the intervention, or is it more effective if there's some person from the outside who comes in? So far, what we know are that the data are mixed on this. And it likely depends on how much training the classroom teacher has. So obviously the classroom teacher already has a relationship with the students, and that's really important. But it's also very important for the classroom teacher to be well trained. What we know is that teaching mindfulness isn't as easy as it appears. Often it looks easy, but you really have to, in order to teach it right, you really have to embody the practice. You really have to have your own mindfulness practice. And that is what is most well communicated to students. So likely, if the classroom teacher has a solid mindfulness practice that is able to internalize what mindfulness is about to the students, that it is successfully taught. Also, what we find is that there's a developmental period that's generally more successful, and that's age 15 to 18. Seems to be more effective. It seems to be able to pick up more on mindfulness concepts and practice than those who are younger. The dosage, the amount of the length of the intervention also is important. The more time the program, the longer the program is, or the more time is spent in teaching the program, likely the more effective the program is. But yet, there's still more work that needs to be done on this, and more studies need to look at this, because sometimes if it's too long, it will turn some students off to the programs. So likely there's an optimal amount of practice, but what it's looking like is there's a certain amount that is required in order for it to be effective. We know that it's more effective with clinical samples, in other words, with youth who have already been diagnosed with anxiety or depression, and it's also more effective with decreasing anxiety and depression. We also, some of the strengths of the studies were that there are large studies overall, that there were, many of these studies had more than 100 people in them. They were generally balanced according to the age range, the gender, and the grade distribution. And we also know that about half of the samples had the majority of non-white participants. Most of them were held during classroom hours, during school. And about 1/3 of the studies included out-of-school practice. And as I said before, many of the studies used elements and components of MBSR. So those are all strengths of the studies. There are also limitations of the studies and areas that are important to delve into more with research. So, for example, we need more studies that are randomized controlled trials. We know that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for studies. It's the best way to study something. Often we can't do a randomized control study because they're expensive and they're more difficult to conduct. But we need to do them. It's a better way to study, and we need to have active controls. So a control group that mimics the intervention group, the mindfulness group, in format and structure. So in other words, it looks like the mindfulness program, except it doesn't have mindfulness in it. And that way you can compare the two different programs. It's also important to statistically account for classroom and school effects. And what I mean by this is that when you are studying students in the classroom who are within or are in schools, there might be certain attributes that are particular to the classroom or particular to the school that affect the outcomes. There's a way to control for this statistically, but often that has not been done in research studies. So that's another area that needs to be, future studies need to look at. More studies need to include students with disabilities, and we need to include more information about the socioeconomic status of the participants. This has largely been left out. And of course, that's something that can affect outcomes. So we need to look at that. And we need to do more research that's replicating the existing programs. So often what we see is that people are developing their own programs, and that doesn't really give us a lot of good information about what's out there on the existing program. So we need to do more research on existing programs that we already have some information about. More information about gender differences. So we know that males and females have developed differently over the course of childhood and adolescence. And we need to look at what kind of programs are more appropriate for boys and for girls. We also need to look at the people who are leading the intervention, right? We need to look at what their training is, how much training they've had, and what kind of training they've had, and also how much training is necessary. So teachers in schools, for example, if they're going to be leading the intervention, we need to have some information about what kind of training they've had. And we need to look at more diverse outcome measures. So many of these studies have just asked the students about their depression and anxiety, for example. We need to ask others as well. So asking teachers and asking parents about the behavior of the student, for example. Also, it'd be helpful to look at the different components of the studies themselves and to see what components are really affecting the outcomes. Is it a particular mindfulness practice, for example, that is really effective so that we can tailor the interventions to be more effective? We also need to include some real world outcomes. So looking at things like student achievement, to looking at behavior data in schools, looking at attendance data. Not very many studies have looked at this so far. We also, it's very important to look at some follow-up data. Right now, we don't have any data that looks at beyond a year beyond the intervention, for example. So do these mindfulness practices that we're teaching the students, do they last? You know, do they last 3 months out or 6 months out or a year out? We need to know how much students really need to practice in order to instill the benefits of mindfulness, of the mindfulness programs. This is something else that we really need to look into. And also we need to look at the fidelity of the intervention delivery. So are the programs being taught the way that they're intended to be taught? This is looked at in some studies, but not enough. So we need to do that as well. We need to look at some of the mechanisms. So in other words, how are the programs working? How are they affecting the outcomes? What are the pieces of the program that are really making a difference? And the last thing I want to talk about in the mindfulness piece, and then I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about self-compassion, is I wanted to just mention this new review that is actually not yet published, so I didn't want to include it with the other data that I was presenting. But this is a review that covers 73 different studies across 5 different continents. And so it's very extensive, and it's different in that it looks at the quality of the studies. So what this study reports, for example, the chart that you're looking at here is a look at mental health, that 29% of these 73 studies looked at mental health, looked at the mental health outcomes. 64% showed improvement in depression, 80% showed improvement in anxiety. And these are all the different, I'm not going to go through all the different percentage of studies and the different outcomes, but you can see here that they covered a lot of different areas of improvement and a lot of different outcomes. So in summary, what they found were that the highest quality studies of mindfulness showed improvement in resilience and in generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsiveness, panic, and worry. And the second highest quality studies, which also were pretty high quality studies, showed improvement in self-concept, in self-regulation and emotion regulation, in coping, in executive function, in cognitive control, in mood, in social bias, and in attention problems. So those were what this most recent review found. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about self-compassion. So self-compassion is a very close cousin to mindfulness. There's self-compassion in mindfulness, and there's mindfulness in self-compassion. And the definition of self-compassion that we use is being kind to yourself when you're struggling, being nurturing, protective, caring, and motivating, treating yourself as you would treat a good friend. And we know that about 80% of us are much harder on ourselves than we are on our good friends. So what self-compassion practice, self-compassion intervention teaches us is how we can be kinder to ourselves and treat ourselves better, knowing that it has many positive outcomes, which I'll be talking about right now. There are three components to self-compassion. One is mindfulness. Another is common humanity, and that's understanding that others struggle also, others experience the same kinds of emotional struggles as we do. And the last part is self-kindness. So when we are struggling, being kind to ourselves and treating ourselves well. I'm going to be drawing from two meta-analyses and reviews on self-compassion research with youth. The first one was published in 2018 and looks at self-compassion and what they call psychological distress, which is stress, anxiety, and depression, a measure of those three together, and looks at the relationship between self-compassion and psychological distress. There are 19 different studies that they looked at for this meta-analysis, and two were intervention studies. One was longitudinal, four were longitudinal, and then 13 were just looking at the relationship between these two different things. Self-compassion and psychological distress. The Pullmer review meta-analysis was published in 2019 and looked specifically at the relationship between depression and self-compassion. And I'm just going to summarize the findings here. And that's that there's a strong negative relationship between self-compassion and depressive symptoms, meaning that the more self-compassionate the youth were, the less they experienced depressive symptoms. And also there's a strong correlation between self-compassion and psychopathology. So psychopathology, remember, was putting together stress, anxiety, and depression. There were mixed findings on gender. What we do know is that older adolescent girls are less self-compassionate than boys of the same age, and also less self-compassionate than girls who are younger. And when looking at the subscales of self-compassion separately, there were relationships between self-kindness and mindfulness, but not with common humanity. I'm pulling out a couple of different studies here to look at individually, because I thought they might be really interesting to you. And one thing that is particularly interesting about the research on self-compassion in youth is that it's really international. And so I have on each of these slides the country where the sample comes from. This particular one is one of our studies. So it comes from the United States. And here what we're looking at is the relationship between age and depression. And what we know is that as teens get older, they get more depressed. So you can see that that the line is going up. But for those teens who have highest self-compassion, depression increases the least as teens get older. So in other words, self-compassion has a protective effect against depression as teens age. What we're seeing here in this graph is the relationship between stress and depression. And again, what we know is as people get, and particularly as youth get more stressed, their depression goes up. So that's how you see these 3 lines that are going up from left to right. But for those teens with the greatest amount of self-compassion, even with the same amount of stress, they experience less depression. And this was another one of our studies in the US. This study was with a Portuguese sample, and we're looking at the relationship between depression and non-suicidal self-injury. So that's cutting or self-injury, which is incredibly common among youth. And again, we see that there is a relationship, a positive relationship between depression and non-suicidal self-injury. As depression increases, the likelihood for non-suicidal self-injury increases as well. But among youth with the highest amount of self-compassion, there's less of an increase. There's of cutting. In this study that's taking place in China, what we're looking at is the relationship between victimization and non-suicidal self-injury. So we know as these were youth that were victimized in school at a young age. And what we see is, and what we know is that as victimization increases, the likelihood for non-suicidal self-injury increases as well. So what we're seeing here is that those with high self-compassion, again, there's much less of an increase of non-suicidal self-injury. It increases a little bit, but not a lot. In this study, which was from a sample in Australia, they assessed high school students in 9th grade and in 10th grade. And what we saw among those 9th graders with low self-esteem, that for those who had high self-compassion, there was no change in mental health a year later. But for those 9th graders who had low self-esteem in 9th grade, they had and low self-compassion, then they had worse mental health a year later. And here what we're looking at is the relationship between self-compassion and social anxiety. And what we see is that the more self-compassionate youth were, the less they experienced social anxiety. And this is a very strong relationship. And it's what we're seeing here is that it's mediated by a fear of negative evaluation, meaning that this is what explains why self-compassion is protective against social anxiety. So students, because these students were afraid of being negatively evaluated by their peers, they had social anxiety. And because they avoided their feelings, this is cognitive avoidance, they experienced social anxiety. But this was less prevalent in those students with higher self-compassion. So what we're seeing is a buffering effect of of self-compassion in students. And so if I can go backwards for a second, what we see in one study with chronic academic stress in a study among Chinese students is they had worse well-being and negative mood, but those with greater self-compassion had less negative mood. And among students who had been experienced victimization, this is a different study in Spain, that those with high self-compassion had better mental health, even though they had been victimized. And then in a study that was conducted in an Israeli population of Israeli refugees, those who had, these refugees had experienced a traumatic event, a devastating forest fire. And among this population of students, those who had had high self-compassion had less PTSD, less suicidal ideation, less anxiety, less depression. So just quickly, this is a study that was mindfulness meditation retreat. And in the meditation retreat, the students experienced increased positive mood and life satisfaction and decreased rumination and stress and depressive symptoms. And what they found was that mindfulness, increased mindfulness is what was driving some of the effects, but self-compassion actually was driving more of the effects. And this was particularly interesting because this was a mindfulness meditation retreat, but yet we know that self-compassion is in mindfulness. So what this researcher found was that self-compassion was really driving more of the effects than mindfulness. And this is a couple of our studies here that I'm reporting on. And Making Friends with Yourself is a self-compassion program for teens that was adapted from an adult self-compassion program called Mindful Self-Compassion. And what we found at the end of the program was that there was an increase in resilience and an increase in curiosity and exploration. And curiosity and exploration is willingness to try new things and move outside of the comfort zone. And there was a decrease in negative mood, anxiety, and perceived stress and depression. And we found that mindfulness also was the driver of some of these effects, but self-compassion actually was driving more of these effects. And the last study that I'm going to be talking about is a very new study. We're still collecting follow-up data on this study, but what we found from pre to post are these effects. And this is with teens who are transgender. They have a very high rate of suicide ideation and suicide attempts. Over 50% attempt suicide. And what we see here are significant effects, decreases in depression, anxiety from pre to post, increases in mindfulness and self-compassion, significant increases in their satisfaction, life satisfaction, resilience. And particularly, I want to point this out, the first two, the farthest bars on the left, what we're looking at is significant decreases in thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. And these two are precursors or strongly associated with suicide attempts. So I was really happy to see that we got significant changes there in those particular constructs. So just to summarize, we know self-compassion is inversely proportional to psychopathology and it's protective against a lot of negative outcomes, particularly effective in high-risk teens. And we know that there are programs that can really help. There are some limitations in future directions and similar to those that we find with populations. We need more controlled studies. We need more consistency of scales used and looking at more clinical samples, for example. And I would just like to leave you with this thought, and that's that adolescence is a critical period for intervention to determine the mental health trajectory through adulthood. We know that if we can change things in adolescence, that it will have an effect across the entire lifespan. So we need to ask ourselves, how will we proceed? What changes will we make at this point in our world? So thank you very much.
네, 교수님 강의 잘 들었습니다. 감사합니다. 제가 한 두 가지 정도 질문을 좀 드리겠습니다. 이제 우리 동국대학교에서는 이제 자아 명상이라고 해서 이제 모든 학생들이 꼭 들어야 되는 그 과목이 있습니다. 그런데 교수님 강의에 전적으로 동감을 하면서 이제 무슨 말인가 하면은 학생들이 1학년이냐 4학년이냐 또는 뭐 남학생이냐 여학생이냐에 따라 이 수업의 어떤 변화가 굉장히 다른 모습을 볼 수 있거든요. 그리고 이제 그 교수님의 강의를 들으면서 굉장히 청소년들을 향해서 굉장히 따뜻한 마음으로 연구를 하고 계신다, 이런 생각으로 감사하게 생각하고요. 질문은 교수님께서 평상시에 마음챙김과 자기연민을 어느 정도 하고 계시는지가 궁금하고요. 두 번째는 그 청소년들에게 마음챙김과 자기연민이 굉장히 필요하고 효과가 많이 나타나는데 그러면 이런 것을 어떻게 발전시켜 나가고 미국에서는 얼마 정도 이런 청소년들에게 적용이 되고 있는지 학교에서 두 가지 질문을 좀 드리겠습니다.
Okay, so if I can, I'm just going to repeat the question because I want to make sure that I understand it. So first of all, how much meditation practice do I do? Was that the first part of the question?
네, 맞습니다.
Yes. I have been practicing mindfulness meditation since I was a senior in high school myself. So since I was about 17 years old, a very long time ago. And I practiced regularly, and I practice daily. I have a meditation group or several meditation groups actually that I sit with at each one is once a week, but there's several, so it's a couple times a week. That was the first part of the question, right? And then is mindfulness in schools? Some schools in the US, yes. It depends where in the US. It depends, where in the US is a big question because there's some parts of the US that are much more open to it than others. And then within that, there are some schools that are much more open than other schools. We are always trying to get it in mindfulness and self-compassion practices in schools. So I don't know the percentage of schools that actually have practice, but it's not enough, in my opinion. Yeah, did I miss any part of the question?
아닙니다. 이제 줌으로 들어온 질문을 제가 좀 드리겠습니다. 청소년에게 마음챙김, 자기연민 명상 프로그램이 긍정적 영향을 많이 주고 있다는 것을 잘 이해했습니다. 반대로 청소년에게 명상 프로그램을 진행하는 데 있어서 어려움 또는 부작용은 무엇인지, 또 그것을 극복하는 카렌 교수님의 방법은 무엇인지도 궁금합니다. 이런 질문입니다.
So when we teach mindfulness to students what are the hurdles or the obstacles? Was that the question?
네, 맞습니다.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, there are hurdles, there are obstacles. Many of the students that come to us for our programs, often it's the parent's idea. You know, the parent wants the child wants the child to come, and so sometimes the child is a little bit resistant, and but what we have found, the way to get over that is not to pressure them, is to invite them to participate, to encourage them gently to participate. But if we are too heavy-handed about it, it backfires. It doesn't work. So they will be more resistant. They will fight harder. And you can't make somebody do this. You know, you have to make it as enjoyable and as pleasant as possible. So the way that we do this is, first of all, by having a nice environment, having a gentle environment, to, you know, encourage them to participate, but not to force them. If they say they don't want to, then we say, okay, that's fine. You don't have to participate. You can just be there, you know, but you can't bother anybody else, you know. We have been teaching, conducting these programs through the pandemic over Zoom. It's a little bit, in some ways it's more difficult, and in some ways it's easier. So it's easier in that technology is, you know, students like technology, and, you know, teens like technology, and they're very comfortable with it. So in that way, it's easier for them. They like being in their own space, and you know, having their cat on their lap, or, you know, being in their bedroom. The challenge has been, we have been requiring them to keep the video on. And the reason we do this is for safety, that we want to know that they are safe. We want to be able to see them. Sometimes these practices can generate a feeling of, you know, can bring up feelings that that aren't comfortable, you know, anxiety or sadness, and so we want to be able to see them and know that they're okay. So we also want to make sure that there isn't anybody, for the sake of confidentiality, that there isn't anybody else in the room that, you know, could hear the other students. We do require a parent to come on at the beginning of each class and just wave hello at us, so that we know that they're in the house, that they're that they're present, because we want to know that if the student was to, you know, to get anxious and turn off their video, we want to know that there's an adult present there. Did that answer some of the questions?
네, 감사합니다. 또 한 가지 질문을 드리겠습니다. 줌으로 들은 질문인데요. 자기 연민과 자기 자신을 사랑하는 것은 서로 다른가요? 이런 질문입니다.
It's a very good question. Yeah. They're a little bit different. So, because loving oneself is, it's part of self-compassion, but self-compassion also includes a part where you're actively doing something to take care of yourself. So the self-kindness piece of self-compassion means that you're taking an active role to either protect yourself from harm, or to, you know, if you're feeling sad, to do something, you know, to go for a walk, or to have a cup of tea, to do something that is soothing for you. So there's an active component. Self-compassion also encompasses a common humanity element, which is, and I mentioned this earlier, understanding that we're not alone in our suffering, understanding that that other people also experience feelings of sadness and anxiety and feeling lonely and feeling frustrated and feeling hurt. And although that might sound really obvious, when we're actually in that place, when we're actually the ones who are feeling really badly or feeling badly about ourselves, or feeling inadequate or feeling worthless, we tend to forget that other people struggle also. We tend to think we're the only ones. So self-compassion also incorporates that element of it. So it's a little bit more encompassing than loving ourselves. And there's also the mindfulness component to it. So it's a little bit different.
네, 자기연민과 자기 사랑과 이 다른 점을 충분히 잘 들었습니다. 인류애적인 것이 이제 자기연민 이런 부분이라고 말씀을 드렸고요. 자, 또 한 가지 질문이 들어왔습니다. 수동적이고 회피하려는 청소년이 명상 프로그램에 적극적으로 참여하게 만들려면 강력한 동기부여가 필요할 텐데요. 주로 어떤 방법을 시도할 수 있을까요? 이런 질문입니다.
There's a student who is very passive. I think I would probably say something like, why don't you try it and just see what you think? See if you like it. Try one class, and see if you like the one class. And there are different kinds of practices for different kinds of students, and we offer a variety of many different kinds of practices, and some appeal to some students and some appeal to other students. So I would encourage them, I would let them know a little bit about the different kinds of things that are out there. And we have, for youth, we have a music meditation, for example, and we have art activities that we do, mindful art activities. So we do different kinds of things that appeal to different kinds of learners. Is that helpful?
예, 좋습니다. 예, 좋습니다. 부정적이고 좀 이제 수동적인 학생들에게는 한번 해보자. 이렇게 시도해보는 게 좋다는 말씀이셨습니다. 한 가지가 더 들었는데요. 마지막으로 한 가지 질문만 더 드리겠습니다. 요즘같이 코로나 시대는 직접적으로 만나기가 참 어려운 시대인데요. 이런 시대에, 이런 변화에 자기연민 프로그램은 어떻게 적응해야 할까요? 적용해야 할까요? 이런 내용인데요.
Yeah. So how do we teach self-compassion in COVID? Was that question?
네, 맞습니다. 네.
Yeah. So when we had the first lockdown in last March, I realized that students would be at home with their families, which sometimes is a very good thing, and sometimes can be very difficult depending on their relationship, family relationships. At least this is how it is in the U.S. But it's it can be very challenging. So in April, we decided to offer 2 different self-compassion classes, one for younger teens, 11 to 14, and one for older teens, 15 to 18. So we just offer them online. We offer them through Zoom. And by the way, we do this for adults as well. And yeah, and I mentioned that, you know, we have certain requirements. We have a whole protocol that we follow actually about that parents and students have to agree to. And as I mentioned, the parent has to be, or an adult at least, has to be in the home. The video has to be on. But we've made some adaptations to the curricula itself to make it more, to make it easier to teach over Zoom, but not a lot. We haven't made a lot of changes. We've made a few changes. We've made it a little bit shorter because the program was 1 hour and 45 minutes, and that's pretty long to be on Zoom. So it's 1 hour and a half. But we make it as comfortable for the teens as possible, meaning, you know, they can have their pet, their dog or their cat there. They can have a snack. They can have whatever they, whatever makes them feel more at ease. Yeah, but the program's pretty much the same.
네, 장시간 이렇게 질문에 답해 주신 캐런 블루스 교수님께 큰 박수로서 마무리하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's my pleasure.